Hey crafty people, it's Tasha here for Heffy Doodle, and today we're going to be talking masking made easy. I feel like masking always comes up as one of those techniques that people can feel intimidated by, but I'm sharing this one layer card along with some tips and tricks, plus how Heffy Doodle has everything you need to mask like a pro. Today we'll be using this Dear to Me stamp set along with some Heffy Memo Tape. So let's get right into it. I'm going to stamp my deer images onto Memo Tape, just using my mini Misty because it's easier. For anyone who's never tried our Memo Tape, it's a very low tack adhesive so it won't tear your project, but it's thick enough to allow for stamping and inking over the top without letting that ink through to ruin your project that way either. Once I've stamped onto that, I'm going to stamp those same images onto an A2 panel of white cardstock. There is still some ink residue on my stamp, so I don't want to place it directly onto my paper and transfer ink before I'm 100% sure where I want that image to be. So I'm just using some clear packaging to act as a barrier whilst I position my images. Then I'll pick them up with my Misty door and remove that packaging to stamp them. When you're working with a one layer scene like this, you start with the images you want to be closest to the front first. Then you cover those and add the second layer. You just continue like that, masking each layer before stamping the next or previous until you reach the very back of your scene. There are so many ways that you can use this technique, and once you're confident in the basics, you can make some seriously complicated and busy scenes. Now, I'm fuzzy cutting that image that I stamped onto the Heffy Memo Tape. This is easy once you know where to make that cut. If you make your cut on the outside of the line, then you risk leaving a halo effect around your images. But if you cut it on the inside of the line, you risk leaving some of your image unmasked. So let's split the difference. We're going to cut through the line. This is super easy to do with the images from Heffy Doodle because they've got a nice thick outline, making them perfect for masking. Take your time lining up your mask, and don't be afraid to lift it and reapply if you aren't happy with your initial placement. Be extra mindful of any little detail areas, as these can be a little tricky to line up, but really, practice makes progress with this. Now, my foreground images are masked, so I'm adding a really simple backdrop of these tree trunks, which are from the same stamp set. I want a little bit of a background, but I'm keeping it quite abstract and more of a suggestion of a backdrop rather than a full scene. To keep it softer, I'm stamping my trees with coloured ink to give it a no line effect that contrasts nicely with the bold black focal images. I've also stamped these trees onto some Memo Tape because another way to use masking is for adding quick ink blended backgrounds. For this, you need to mask everything. I'm only planning to add colour behind the deer themselves, not the entire height of the trees, so I only need to mask just the bottoms of them. Before ink blending, I'm double checking that the edges of my masks are securely stuck down, as I don't want them lifting. Then I'm just adding some colour. There's no special technique here, so I am speeding through, but I'm basically just adding the ground so that my images aren't floating off into nothing, starting with a light green, then adding some contrast with a darker shade of green. For my sky, I'm adding blue without even masking my ground because, as I said, this is really more of an abstract background. Then I'm only taking it up as far as the top of the sitting deer, and then I'm just going to let it fade off to white. Now is the best bit. Peeling up those masks to reveal the result of our masking. This bit never gets old. Store the masks on the acetate for your stamp set and you can use them again in the future. Now we're done with the masking, I'm going to start working on the trees. To keep the background softer, I'm opting for colouring pencils for my trees, and this is going to keep the colour from being too vibrant. Starting at the bottom, and again using a couple of different shades to give me some contrast. I'm colouring with a curved motion to help give my trees some dimension, concentrating the darker shades around my images and then fading out as I move up the tree in the same way that I let that sky fade out. I did decide to add a bit of shading around the detail lines of my trees all the way up. To soften and blend that pigment even more, I'm going to use a Tombow blender marker. This isn't meant for this, it's actually a watercolour marker, but it's going to give a subtle softening effect. It won't give the same effect as some type of solvent blender, but it's a lot easier to use and it doesn't give off any potentially harmful odours. Now, onto the main attraction. I'm using my Copic markers for both of my deers, and this is going to give me some much more pigmented colour, which further helps to cement these as the focal aspect of this design. That doesn't mean I aren't still going to make it as easy as possible on myself though. I've got 3 shades of brown for each deer, so I'm going to start with my lightest shade all over. Then I'll map out my shadows with shade number 2. Literally just adding a line, following wherever I feel there would be a shadow, and really not being too selective about it. Then this is going to guide me where to add my darkest shade as I go over the lines I've already added before extending that with more of that shade 2 and going back to shade 1 to pull it out further. Adding the lighter colours first helps me blend out that scary dark shade for a more gradual transition. Anywhere that I feel that the transition is too stark, I'll soften it even more by touching nibs to transfer a little of that darker pigment, giving a shade somewhere between the two. The longer you touch, the more pigment will cross over, so you do have some control as to how dark this new shade's going to be. When you're done, just clean it off by just colouring onto scrap cardstock until you're back to that original shade. This isn't going to work as well if your shades are too far apart, but it's a great technique to extend your range of markers. For the second deer, I used shade 2 as my shade 1, and then I added an even darker marker for the third shade. Then I've just added some shadows beneath both of them just to ground them even more. One way that I like to elevate my colouring is to go over the top of my markers with colouring pencils. This is an extra step that I picked up from Kathy Rakusan's 30-day colouring challenge, and fun fact, the bag that I store my pencils in that you can see there at the top of the screen is from the amazing Amanda at Pear Blossom Press, and it's got all of Kathy's colouring tips on it. Once I'm done with that, I'm going to add my sentiment, which is of course a perfectly punny one. Heffy Doodle always kills it with these, and I am such a sucker for a pun. I've got photos, details and supplies, including marker colours and inks, over on the Heffy Doodle blog with the link below in the description box. Drop me a comment below to let us know whether you've ever tried masking, and if you've got any questions, then add those to the comments too. Thank you for spending this time with me, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel if you aren't already. Have a lovely, happy, safe and wonderful week. Stay crafty. Bye.